Hey, I'm Nathaniel Fossen. I'm a professional archaeologist currently excavating in northern Texas, and I specialize in the pre-colonial archaeology of North America's eastern woodlands, where I've been working and studying for more than 10 years. Today I want to talk about how we investigate warfare in the eastern woodlands prior to its colonization by Europeans. In American archaeology, the topic of conflict and warfare has gotten a bit of a late start. It didn't really gain much dedicated attention in the literature until the mid 80s to the 90s. And I've read a few ideas about why that might have been. One reason may have been that archaeologists at the time were trying to avoid perpetuating negative stereotypes about North Americans being bloodthirsty barbarians, that kind of thing. So they focused their research on other topics like subsistence strategies and technological developments, things like that. So another issue is that the absence of written records really frustrates this entire discussion. It's really difficult to see warfare-related patterning in the archaeological record without a designated branch of theory that deals with how to spot it. And regardless, since about the mid-90s, we've started to look much more seriously at the role that warfare and conflict played in the lives of pre-colonial North Americans. Now, I need to talk about what we mean by the word warfare. There's a lot of 21st century baggage tied up in that word for most people. So modern people will tend to think of wars as being fought by armies that are trained, funded, and fielded by nation states in order to fight other nation states and their armies. And that's a very narrow and recent manifestation of the warfare phenomenon. George Milner describes warfare as potentially lethal fighting among separate communities that is viewed as a legitimate, even desirable means of advancing a group's position relative to that of its neighbors. And Brian Ferguson defines it as organized, purposeful group action directed against another group involving the actual or potential application of lethal force. So in either case, what we're looking at is a three-component definition of warfare. You have the application of violent force by a community rather than an individual that is considered by that community to be a justified and appropriate course of action. Now, the question is, how do we go about analyzing archaeological data in order to understand warfare? An archaeologist named Julie Solometo has broken warfare down into 7 attributes, which she calls dimensions, and she uses that to facilitate the analysis of conflict and warfare in pre-industrial societies. Although it works for industrial societies also. And while I do think her system could use a little bit of tweaking, it's an incredible starting point and completely changed how I see and look at warfare as a phenomenon. So first is social distance, and this has nothing to do with COVID. Social distance describes the affiliation between the warring parties. So you might think of this as the amount of the degree of empathy between the two groups or the multiple groups. If you have very close social distance, like we saw in the American Civil War, where the two sides generally considered themselves to be basically the same people, we might expect to see less brutal behaviors like sparing of women and children, ritualized burial of the enemy's dead, care for prisoners of war, things like that. So if the social distance is very high, though, we might expect to see more indiscriminate killing, bodily mutilation, like the taking of body parts for trophies, like scalps and things like that, moving into the territory that we would now think of as genocide. There's not enough, if there's enough social distance between the warring parties that each sees the other as subhuman or inhuman or lesser than, then this kind of behavior can become celebrated, not just tolerated. So social scale describes the size of the communities involved in the conflicts. We might see signs of violence that appear to be petty conflicts between two villages, or we might see much broader regional conflict involving much larger populations. Goals describe the desired outcome of warfare, of the conflict in the first place. And the goals are going to have important implications for other dimensions, like tactics. So what is the point of the conflict? Is the region being invaded by another group? is the fighting over disputed access to resources like hunting or fishing rights, farmland, tool resources, things like that. Some cultures have institutionalized warfare for the sake of earning prestige among the combatants. If a drought causes a food shortage, that pressure may lead people to raid each other's villages to feed themselves. If populations boom, that may prompt expansion into another group's territory. So we also have to think about the effect of magic in terms of goals. Not believing in what most people today would consider magic is a fairly recent phenomenon. 1,000 years ago, if your community experienced a catastrophe like a crop failure or a disease, the blame for that could fall on some other community's use of witchcraft, and if that belief is strong enough, it could easily result in violent retaliation, which escalates into war. So tactics is a big one. These are the deliberate methods used by the warring parties, and as I said, these are informed by the goals of each group as well as the military tradition of each group, the military culture that each group has developed over their time on the landscape. So if the object is to acquire loot, the conflicts might only be short hit-and-run raiding ventures for valuables, resources, or slaves. That's going to be presenting a different set of logistical challenges to conflicts that are motivated by expansionism, taking of territory or keeping of territory, where groups are trying to maintain control over particular landscapes. The weapons used in combat are also going to have implications for what sorts of tactics are even feasible. So in North America, the primary weapons were chipstone blades for knives and spears, as well as groundstone axes and war clubs, like the ones that I've talked about in several previous videos. I'll put links to those in the description. That means that combat had to be a fairly close range affair until the bow and arrow finally became widespread at the end of the Middle Woodland. Of course, they did have throwing spears like atlatls, but the arc and distance covered by those still means that it's going to be you're in pretty close proximity to whoever you're fighting. The specific sites to be attacked and defended also carry tactical significance. So main camps that might be targeted to inflict maximum destruction or isolated resource procurement sites may be chosen due to their poor defensibility or to cut off important supplies. So if one of the goals is to take hostages, then tactics and weaponry will have to reflect that. The deliberate destruction of property or resources during raids has further reaching consequences to the victims than that of the actual event of violence. So if the raiding party destroys all the food, the resultant starvation might cause an even higher mortality rate than anyone who is directly killed during the attack. So the use of landscape also has a tactical choice under Solometo's model. Are people occupying fortified villages with wooden palisades? We see that start to happen in the Woodland and Mississippian periods. Do we see populations spread out in small camps that are more difficult to find? Or are they clustered together on high ground for a safety in numbers sort of tactic? So frequency describes the number of attacks that occur within a given time period. How many times do attacks happen per year? And this has some implications for the use of landscape that I talked about before. So some anthropological work has been done on how pre-industrial groups respond to outbreaks of violence. And it appears that the construction of fortifications or relocation to more defensible landforms is only considered worth the effort if attacks occur at least once a year. So if you're looking at a settlement pattern where your site locations change very, very suddenly, like over the course of a single generation within, 30 radiocarbon years, something like that, then it's very possible that there was an outbreak of warfare around that time period. So predictability is the degree to which people know when attacks are coming, if they're seasonally correlated. So do raids only happen in the warm summer months, or have they been known to happen all year long? If they're seasonal, then special defensive measures might be abandoned during what are considered safe months. So attacks might be expected in unusual circumstances too. Like if a member of your community recently murdered a member of another community, they might stage a raid for revenge, which may prompt a temporary relocation or sending out scouts or something along those lines. Duration applies both to the length of the individual battles. Does it happen over the course of a couple of hours or days? But also to the length of time that hostilities persist between parties. So if tensions between groups escalate and persist for years or decades, settlement patterns and entire subsistence strategies might be completely changed. Focus on storable resources like grain crops may take on new importance so that vulnerable hunting parties or foraging parties don't have to be away from base camps uh, for as often or for as long. So, using Solometo's model, we know what to look for in the archaeological record beyond simply the marks of wounds on bones or uh, other kind of direct physical evidence, like bodily evidence, in order to identify outbreaks of endemic warfare. And if we're able to fill in the information about each dimension for whatever time and place we're talking about, we can start to put together a very clear picture of what that warfare looked like. Even if we can't quite identify an individual battle on the order of like a Battle of Hastings or Washington's crossing of the Delaware or any like event like that, there are a few places and time periods that look like they might be episodes of regional violence and regionalized warfare. So in some parts of the Southeast, for instance, we see the abandonment of certain structures, like monumental structures, mounds, and relocation of villages up into high ground. So like after the Capina culture collapses in central Tennessee, groups like the Owl Hollow culture that lived between the Elk and the Duck rivers seem to have done this. And so trade networks breaking down suddenly, like at the end of the Hopewell interaction around the Ohio River, may also have come with an increase in regional warfare. And then, of course, in the Mississippian period, large palisades were built around settlements to protect against attacks from neighboring settlements and neighboring cities. There is one major event that I know of that we might think of as a possible individual battle that we absolutely can identify, and that's the Crow Creek Massacre in South Dakota, where almost 500 people were violently killed, mutilated, and buried in a mass grave. But that one is going to need its own dedicated video. So that's all I've got for this one. If you have any questions, please leave those in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching.